Are you looking for adventure? Do you want to find peace? Long-distance trails offer you freedom and discovery. They offer a way to connect to yourself and to the world around you at the same time. The most popular trails have become crowded, but there are so many other trails that have plenty of space. The Trails Around the World podcast is here to introduce you to new trails and to new types of trails. Join me as we explore, finding out what is possible and how to do it. Hello everyone, it's been a long time. I was just looking at my most recent episodes. I see that I did 4 episodes last winter after moving back from Japan to the United States in the summer of 2023. I did an episode 12 months ago, 11 months ago, 10 months ago, and then there was an episode 7 months ago that was an interview on another podcast about a trail that I had wanted to cover. So I've been here for over a year now, and my life circumstances, they are in a process of change now. The good news is that I expect to be able to spend more time on this podcast in the future. So if you've been concerned that it might go away, please don't worry about that. I'm planning to stick around. My hiking has definitely slowed down due to the burden of keeping up with family obligations and the pressures of owning a home. I spent 2 days hiking in Vermont with a friend in May, but that is the only hiking that was not local and lasted more than just a few hours. I am working remotely, but that still means that I sit at a desk for 8 hours a day. On the other hand, I've done more boating than I have done in years, perhaps ever. I am much more experienced as a hiker or backpacker than I am as a boater, so I have been focusing on gaining skills and experience. I already knew many of the differences between small boats and hiking, of course, but I think that they are worth commenting on. So this past year, I've been focusing on increasing my skills and experience in boating. Beyond the obvious differences of being on water versus being on land, hiking is predominantly a lower body exercise, whereas boating is predominantly upper body exercise. Although hiking poles and the carrying of a pack on one's shoulders work the upper body, of course, and sliding seat rowing or pedaling a Hobie Mirage drive work the lower body. Hiking is arguably more cardio-focused and boating is arguably more strength-focused. Because one is in a vessel on the water, one can carry far more weight in a boat. Even a sea kayak, with its very limited storage space, is far less sensitive to the weight of equipment than a backpack. But having less reason to spend extra for lightweight gear and materials does not significantly offset the greater equipment costs associated with boating. We humans are land animals, and thus we need more equipment to navigate on water than we need to simply walk someplace. That said, there is a common conception that boating is always expensive, and that is not true. When I lived in the Washington, D.C. area, I joined a sailing club for $50 a year, and in Kobe, Japan, I was able to rent sailboats for $3 an hour. Both of those were for day sailing only, and not compatible with going on a trip. The cost of boating is usually related to the size of the boat. Cheap kayaks and canoes, often made of the nearly indestructible rotomolded plastic, are some of the most cost-efficient boats that you can take voyaging. Sticking with my observation that we are land animals, I like to observe that when one is on land, it sometimes takes a bit of work to get into the wilderness. On the water, however, we are in the wilderness as soon as we cast off. Water conditions change constantly. The possibility of an unplanned entry into the water is ever present, with the accompanying need to be prepared to handle such an event. Wild animals, sometimes dangerous ones, might be only a few feet from us, even though we cannot see them under the water. Just 2 months after we arrived back, I bought a boat. It is a trimaran that was designed for and hand-built for the Everglades Challenge. It sat waiting in my yard through the entire winter last year, under cover. Due to the climate in New England where I'm living, and not having any suitable body of water nearby, I did not get it in the water for the first time until June. My first real boating endeavor this year was the Everglades Challenge. Late last year, I searched for someone who was looking for crew for the challenge. I was looking for someone who had completed the challenge in the past, but was feeling that it would be wise to have crew, most likely a person in their 70s. Luckily for me, there was such a person, and we made arrangements for me to visit Florida in both January and March, first for the boot camp given for intending participants in the Everglades Challenge, and then for the event itself. Since Tom, my skipper, lived in Tampa, he and his wife generously hosted me both times. I set about acquiring the equipment that I did not have. That's the equipment that's required for the Everglades Challenge. Even with someone else taking responsibility for the boat and providing me lodging in Tampa, I found that the Everglades Challenge was a very expensive undertaking. It cost me several $1,000s. The entry fee is not cheap. Traveling back and forth to Florida, despite service through several discount airlines, is expensive and time-consuming. Since I was not outfitting a boat and I did not have to get a spot tracking device, my most challenging pieces of equipment in terms of cost were a dry suit and the personal locator beacon, often called a PLB. I subsequently learned that I could have rented the PLB and that one can also rent a spot. This is a significant way for the first-time participant in the Everglades Challenge or another water tribe event to save money. I was lucky to find a dry suit for sale at a very low price. It was second-hand. It is too large for me, but I ended up liking it that way. The first time I put the dry suit on, one of the wrist gaskets ripped. Such are the hazards of buying a used dry suit. It had been sitting in a closet for several years, I think. So I did my research and ordered the supplies I needed to repair it, and then tested it in my bathtub. I find dry suits extremely uncomfortable, particularly because of the neck gasket. The first time I put it on, my entire head flushed red because of the blood constriction. I found ways to make it better, but it still is not enjoyable and never will be. In cold water, dry suits are a matter of life and death, so either one wears a dry suit when necessary, or one should not participate in activities like the Everglades Challenge. If the word dry suit is a new term for you, it is a suit that seals at your neck and wrists and keeps you dry. One would wear fairly normal dry insulating layers underneath. If you buy a new dry suit, they cost $800 or more. I got a second-hand dry suit for $125, which is extraordinarily inexpensive. You might be more familiar with the term wetsuit. Wetsuits are water-permeable insulated garments, which trap a layer of water next to your skin that stays warm. They are far, far less expensive than dry suits, but they aren't adequate for the long-term cold water immersion, such as could result in a boating accident offshore in an event like the Everglades Challenge. I flew down to Tampa for a long weekend in January. Tom picked me up at the airport, and he and Shirley were absolutely wonderful to be with the entire weekend. We had lunch, and then Tom and I took his boat to a very small man-made lake nearby, sailed out into the middle, and intentionally capsized and recovered the boat 6 times. My dry suit performed well, and we gained a lot of confidence in each other. Tom and I, that is. The next day, we put the boat in the Gulf of Mexico and sailed it around. We practiced a number of man-overboard drills and other maneuvers. For those who don't sail, a man-overboard drill consists of throwing something that floats into the water, and then one of the crew sits out of the action while the remaining crew, the other person, safely turn the boat around and return to pick up the float as quickly as possible. This simulates if one of us fell off the boat and the other one needs to be able to rescue them. It's not as easy as it sounds, but it is a critically important skill And like capsize drills, the details vary from one boat to another. That night we camped at a spot up a river, and in the morning we attended the so-called boot camp for those who plan to participate in the Everglades Challenge. There were several extremely expert speakers, including Pelican. Pelican is the physician and adventurer who was interviewed in episode 7 of this podcast. After the boot camp, we discovered that we were going to have a very hard time getting the boat back to the boat ramp, and spent a number of hours accomplishing that, and then I flew home the next day. In March, I flew back to Florida. Tom picked me up at the airport again. We went to the launching beach that you will be familiar with if you have paid attention to the Everglades Challenge. It's on many videos online, and prepared the boat there on the sand. I posted my own videos of walking up and down the line of boats on the internet. Very, very early the next morning, we went to the beach. The launch occurs soon after sunrise. The sailing conditions across Tampa Bay were good, but the wind died soon afterwards. We sailed on for 36 hours, but a great deal of the time we were becalmed. Becalmed means there's no wind. When we found ourselves drifting, we tried for several hours to row the boat, but it just was not suited to it. We were in our dry suits all night. For much of the night, we were sailing long tacks down the coastline, with the lights of urban Florida always present along the coast. We took turns sailing the tacks of 45 minutes or more, with the other person attempting to nap on one of the seats. We encountered a storm on the second day, which was a threat to us, but much more dangerous for the faster boats that were further south, and further down the course, that is, and further offshore. We sailed late into the second night, trying to make the first checkpoint before the deadline. The tide wasn't high enough when we got to a place called Stump Pass, which is the entry point to the inland area where checkpoint 1 is located. Tom had been given instructions for how to get through the pass at low tide in a sailboat. He had only done this in a shallower draft boat before that. And we tried repeatedly to find our way through the sand and the surf, bashing again and again at the sand. It was shallow enough that there was not too much chance of a capsize, but being swamped was a far greater risk. Eventually we gave up and backed off, sailing back up the beach a short distance to find a place to moor and camp. We saw other challengers, including the proa from Colorado, who were setting up their own camp for the night. We encountered one challenger and a Hobie Tandem Islander who was lost in the darkness, and he was panicking. He repeatedly struck our boat, ran into our boat with his, and he was asking for us to help. He had only one means of navigation, an electronic means, and it had failed. The requirements for the event specifically state that one should have more than one means of navigating. And I think it's safe to say that most people would agree that one of your means of navigating should not require batteries. We were not able to help him, and heard later that he did eventually find a place where he could pull out of the water, and he was safe. He dropped out of the event. He wasn't prepared to continue, and he had a bad experience. He was really scared when we encountered him. We dropped an anchor a couple of 100 feet off of the beach and set up our camp on the boat in the surf, and slept surprisingly well because we were so exhausted. We woke up before dawn and found a way to drag the boat through the pass. Once we were inside, we found we could not sail properly because our centerboard could not be lowered. We struggled into checkpoint 1, and we were the second to last boat before the deadline, before the cutoff, so that anybody after that wasn't allowed to continue. Checkpoint 1 is the only checkpoint where one can conceivably have a boat hauled out. The marina was very kind, and they lifted the boat out of the water and put it on cradles for us, despite their business being very busy that day. Tom got underneath it with a long knife and spent a couple of hours working to free the centerboard. All of the time that we had spent bashing against the sand and the surf the previous night had jammed that sand, and also that morning getting through the pass, had jammed that sand into the slot around the centerboard, making the centerboard non-functional. The centerboard is completely necessary for the dynamics of sailing, so you cannot sail the boat. We couldn't have continued if we couldn't get the centerboard down. We launched again, tacking slowly down the intercoastal waterway. We spent much of the afternoon becalmed on Gasparilla Sound, but it was very beautiful, and there were dolphins playing near the boat. Just after sunset, we were hit by an intense storm. I believe that this may be the storm that dismasted other participants in the challenge further to the south. We did not have time to prepare ourselves when we were hit by the storm. We didn't see it coming, and when it hit us, we had full sail up. We had an absolutely terrifying experience crossing the bay under full sail, and in a sense this was our most embarrassing moment, and I'll admit why here. Even though we were both sailors with years of experience, neither of us thought to furl the jib. Every sailor knows that the most basic response to a situation like this, being hit by a sudden squall, a sudden storm, is to reduce your sail area. And we had an easy way to do so by furling the jib. That's just yank on a string and then roll up the jib. Just pull for a while on a string, and the sail area goes away. I have to say that between exhaustion and panic, that is the only explanation I can offer for why we had such a simple failure about the action to take. But it's a real lesson to me about having presence of mind at a time like that. As a sidebar to explain the terminology, the jib is the forward sail on a boat. There are other names, but jib will work for the purposes here. Furling is folding or rolling up part or all of a sail to reduce its area in relation to the wind so that it generates less power. A roller furling jib is a common arrangement that can quickly roll up the jib by simply pulling on a thin line from the cockpit, which immediately reduces the boat's total sail area by 25 or 50%. Tom did a great job, after we survived that crossing of the bay, of finding a place to shelter at a place called Punta Blanca Island. There were many large motor yachts moored in that general area, but we tucked into a more shallow spot that they couldn't access, or most of them couldn't, that was sheltered on three sides. It was quiet and reassuring when we dropped anchor there late at night. In the morning, it was an idyllically peaceful place. One of the people on the only nearby motor yacht called out a good morning once they had risen and were having breakfast. We ate our own breakfasts, hoisted our sails, and sailed on to the south. We were at the very tail end of those boats who were still attempting to finish, and we had lost several hours while we had been becalmed the previous afternoon. We still weren't making good progress, so it was looking unlikely that we would be able to make it to checkpoint 2 before the cutoff time. And then we noticed that one of the spreaders had broken. It had almost certainly happened in the storm the night before. A spreader is part of the system of cables that holds the mast up. The lines, the mast is the stick that is in the middle of the boat that the sails are on. The lines or cables leading from the edges of the boat towards the top of the mast are called shrouds, and the spreaders are located most of the way up the mast, and they hold the shrouds away from the mast, which improves the angles and leverage that keep the mast standing. Tom called an expert on the type of boat we were sailing and asked whether it was safe to carry on with the broken spreader. The response was that there was a possibility that we could succeed, so we should try carrying on. We tightened down the shroud and sailed all day. By afternoon, though, there was another storm headed up from the south. It wasn't likely that we would make the second checkpoint in time to keep from being disqualified, even if circumstances had been better. Sailing on into a storm with a broken spreader would have just been foolish. And so we made plans to drop out of the event in Fort Myers in Florida. Our timing was smart. There was another storm approaching as we came into Fort Myers. We headed for the public boat ramp and the pier that were clearly marked on the charts. When we arrived there, however, they were a construction site. The city had decided to rebuild the facility, but apparently had not informed the charting services ahead of time. The workers told us it would not be possible to dock there. Tom took an aggressive approach, and the guy in charge that evening had the good sense to relent in light of the fact that we were in an emergency situation and needed a safe harbor in our damaged boat as a storm approached. There was a nice restaurant a few hundred feet from the dock, so we were able to simply walk over to it in our boating clothes. We set up the tent on the boat and were comfortable during the night. Early in the morning, the foreman arrived and came over to the boat and told us we had to leave immediately, that we were trespassing on the construction site, and that he had already called the sheriff's department. We did not rush to leave. The sheriff's deputy took his time getting there. Once he did, he helped us figure out where we could go. Like many people in the area, he was a boater himself. We sailed on to another marina where I could stay with the boat while Tom retrieved his trailer. Before the event, Tom had staged one of his two trailers, the larger one that's used for that boat, at another Water Tribe participant's house in Naples, Florida, which is approximately halfway along the course. This turned out to have been a brilliant strategy. Tom's wife, Shirley, drove down from Tampa with his van and met us at the marina. I spent 4 or 5 hours hanging out on the boat while they went and got the trailer. And then we drove on all the way down to Key Largo, where the event would be ending. We called ahead while we were driving and extended our hotel reservations at the hotel in Key Largo. So I spent the next several days at the finish line, welcoming the arriving finishers and hanging out in the nonstop party atmosphere of that spot. I sailed a Corsound 20 Mark III and went out as a passenger on both of the proas that had been in the event. People discussed the fact that it was one of the 2 worst years in the history of the event for sailors, between the predominantly windless days and the multiple storms that had swept through. A bad year for sailors is often a good year for paddlers, and this year was no exception, with many kayaks finishing with good times. At the end of the event, there is a house dedicated for those who have finished the event where they can shower and sleep. There are many restaurants in the area. Hotels are generally expensive and need to be reserved early. There is a banquet on the day after the deadline for arriving in Key Largo, but many people did not stay that long. Tom dropped me off at the airport on his way back, driving back north to Tampa. I got off the plane in New England, where there had been a cold wave, and had to scrape the snow and ice off of my car before driving home in the dark, and I had to get up the next morning for my job. As I mentioned earlier, I did not get my new boat in the water until June. My son came along and helped me on that occasion, and then he also came to the Maine coast with me for 4 days in July to spend some time sailing there. Episode 4 of this podcast was about the Maine Island Trail, and I'm looking forward to exploring it gradually over the coming years. The Maine Island Trail is actually an association that has agreements with landowners and other entities to provide access to wild camping spots and picnic areas along the 300-mile coast, that's 500 kilometers, of Maine, predominantly on islands. Some of these locations need to be reserved, some need to be paid for, but many or most are free. Kayaks make good use of the trail, but so do small sailboats and even motorboats. I needed a place where we could launch, and I wanted to have flexibility in our situation. One issue that I'm still struggling with is that it takes quite a bit of time to launch my boat, more than 2 hours. This means that, at a minimum, one needs to commit an entire day to sailing it, and one needs to watch the clock very carefully. We had 4 days and 3 nights, and I ended up booking all 3 nights at one front country campsite owned and operated by the town of South Freeport, Maine. This would give us the flexibility to either stay there or not. We could even just day sail, if that was what conditions dictated. It looked like it had a nice boat ramp. Like most of the boat ramps in the area, it was tidal. Tidal means you could only use it during high tide. We drove 3 hours to get there the first day, and it wasn't possible to get there before the tide had gone out. The ramp wasn't even underwater when we arrived. But the place was really beautiful. So we walked around and set up the tent and went out to dinner at a restaurant. I woke up before dawn the next morning. It was raining. I was slow to get up and get moving. We set up the boat, and I backed it down the ramp, and it went straight into deep mud. I had failed. I had missed the tide. I was really angry at myself, extremely disappointed. Due to power lines between the ramp and the parking, I had to completely de-rig the boat again immediately so that I could park the trailer. The tide would come in again that afternoon, but as had been the case the previous day, there wouldn't be enough time to get it rigged, launched, and to sail to an island with a campsite before dark. It was 10 o'clock in the morning, and the entire day was already lost or wasted. Checking the forecast confirmed that we would not be launching after low tide. In fact, the updated forecast indicated that we might have dodged a bullet. There was a storm warning for the evening. Having my son with me really saved the day, several times over. The first way it saved the day was that we simply went and enjoyed father-son time as tourists in Portland, Maine, which is nearby. We ended up at a Thai restaurant in Freeport, which was much better than I would expect a Thai restaurant in such a small place to be. We realized that it was the first time that my son had experienced Thai food, and he really loved it. And while we were in the restaurant, an extremely intense storm occurred outside. Thank God we were not out camping on an island when that happened. While we were eating at the Thai restaurant, a nicer meal than we would have had if we had been wet and shivering on an island in the bay, we were brainstorming about how to guarantee that we would finally get the boat launched the next morning. My son asked if there were any all-tide boat ramps nearby, since it was the tide that was giving us problems. In other words, a ramp where we could launch even if it was low tide. I had seen several on the chart, so after the meal and after the storm, we jumped in our van and drove off to look at the possibilities quickly. We only had less than an hour before sunset. We drove from one possibility to another as the light was fading from the sky, and the last place we checked, the third or fourth in the space of like I said, half an hour, was what we were looking for. A town's public ramp, accessible at all tides. It was okay to leave our vehicle and trailer parked there overnight for a moderate fee. We returned to the campsite and found that my tent, which for those equipment heads among you, is a Go-Lite Shangri-La 5. It's more than a decade old, since Go-Lite went out of business a number of years ago. But it had done an impressive job of weathering the intense storm and keeping everything inside dry. This is what that tent is well known for doing. We woke up before dawn the next morning, packed everything quickly, hitched up the boat on its trailer, and drove off to the ramp we had decided on the night before. I tried to be efficient about rigging the boat, but it was good not to have the time pressure imposed by an ebbing tide. We finally launched and worked our way past the marinas full of motorboats and out towards the mouth of the river. The wind was gusty, and we had calm periods alternating with winds strong enough to bend the mast. The slick hulls of my 19-foot trimaran sped along, leaving almost no wake. My boat has a center cockpit and a rear cockpit, as well as 2 large wings on either side of the center cockpit that are each about 2 feet wide and 7 feet long. The wings are designed so that you can sleep on them. One can sail from either of the cockpits, although things are really designed on the assumption that one will normally sail from the rear. The center cockpit also has a pedal drive. I generally stayed in the rear cockpit while my son lounged around the wings and center cockpit, taking care of most of the navigation and providing the power for the pedal drive when I asked him to. The weather was beautiful and pleasantly warm. Once we were out of that river and into the bay, we worked our way south through the islands. I had a couple of ideas about islands where we could camp, but I hadn't used the Maine island trail system before, and I wasn't certain what to expect. We landed at one island, where there was another small boat anchored while its occupants, 2 middle-aged women, were finishing their picnic on the island. With my beachable boat, it was much easier for us. I watched them retrieve their anchor and launch again after swimming out to their boat. Examining the map, I decided where we should try to spend the night. We pushed off again and sailed down to the island campsite I had chosen. It was very small and simple, and there was a cruising sailboat anchored nearby. We unloaded the boat and pitched our tent. We had arrived at high tide, and we were planning to depart at high tide the following morning, so the best way to protect the boat overnight was to let it settle on the bottom as the tide went out. We set an anchor about 75 feet from the shore, and then tied another anchor line to a tree on the beach. We cooked supper as the sun was setting and watched the boat settle onto the hard bottom for the night. We slept well. In the morning we got up, ate breakfast, watched the sunrise, and the boat floated on the incoming tide as planned. We loaded it and then retrieved the anchor. We decided to sail around a larger island nearby as a way of taking a different route back to the boat ramp where the van was with the trailer. This was made possible by having the all-tide boat ramp waiting for us. If it had been the tidal boat ramp at the campsite, then we would have been under much more time pressure and would not have been able to take a chance on a longer route back. My son navigated until the winds died. Then he became our engine for much of the second half of the trip back. As we worked our way up the final part of the river, past 3 or 4 marinas full of boats, a middle-aged couple came by us in their motorboat. When we arrived at the ramp, they commented they had gotten there before us, and they commented that we hadn't been paddling or rowing, but our sails were furled, and we were moving silently but quickly. They asked, did we have an electric motor somewhere? I explained how the pedal drive worked, and it was impressing me at least as much as it would impress them. But I just had a one sun power engine there. We loaded the boat and de-rigged everything, and I drove all the way home that evening. In August, my wife and kids were away for more than half the month. I took the boat for a week-long trip. I have 2 friends who have access to the water on the Chesapeake Bay, so I took the boat on a trip to visit them. One Saturday, I drove down past Wilmington and stayed with a friend in Maryland. On Sunday, I towed my boat onto the second friend south of Annapolis, where I was going to stay 3 nights. We put my boat in the water the next morning, so Monday morning, and rotated between sailing it and using my host's boats, a really fast Nacra catamaran, a collection of kayaks, and several others on Monday and Tuesday. Being very experienced, he gave me a lot of input on my boat, which I am still digesting. I'll be making some modifications before I use it in an event like the Everglades Challenge. On Wednesday, we took my boat out of the water, and I towed it down to a friend's house near Norfolk, Virginia. We sailed it together on Thursday and Friday. Sailing the boat with friends who are more experienced sailors was a great thing for me to do. Their perspectives were both valuable and were very different from each other, and I learned a lot. And, of course, it was wonderful to get so much time on the water that week. And that brings us to the Saturday, the second Saturday of that week. I was up and working on departing early in the morning. I was planning to drive all the way from my furthest point to home on that one last day. That's about 550 miles of driving, or about 900 kilometers, which would be a long haul even if I were just driving an ordinary car without a trailer. Pulling a 23-foot trailer made it much more challenging, and my guess was that I would be on the road for about 14 hours. Things went slowly but smoothly until New Jersey. I stopped at the first rest area after crossing into New Jersey and checked the hitch for the trailer on my van, the tie-downs for the boat on the trailer, and placed my hand on the hubs of the trailer wheels to check their temperature. Everything was doing great. I stopped again in Princeton, near Philadelphia, and became very concerned. One of the trailer's wheel hubs was very warm, indicating a problem with the ball bearings in that wheel. The second friend that I visited had noticed a slight play in that wheel and had voiced concern. I had my grease gun with me, and I greased the trailer's wheel bearings well. It was late afternoon, so I knew I would not arrive home in daylight. I still had more than 4 hours to go. Interstate 287 in western New Jersey is a gritty road, dominated by large trucks pounding around the perimeter of the greater New York City area. I was driving as slowly as I dared in the right lane, due east of Manhattan, when the drag from the trailer increased. I pulled over on the shoulder with the trucks thundering past me. The bearing on the trailer had exploded, blowing away most of its pieces and centrifugally spraying its grease all around the rim of the wheel. It was clear that I wasn't going to get home with things that way. I didn't know what to do. I took the next exit off the highway and pulled into the first gas station. It was a warm Saturday evening, and the attendant was in a chair leaning against his pumps, waiting to be able to close in another hour. I towed the crippled trailer in and got out and walked over to him at the pumps. "I'm in trouble, and I need help," I began. I wasn't surprised that he didn't have any resources to help me, but he told me where I could find an auto repair place that would be open for another hour or two. I dragged the trailer onwards. The auto repair place repaired autos and didn't have any parts for trailers. They referred me to the auto parts store across the street. I spent a little while at the auto parts store, but they didn't have anything that I could use. They called down to a nearby Tractor Supply store. Tractor Supply is a chain in the direction of Pennsylvania from where we were, and asked them if they had any trailer parts and how much longer they would be open. Receiving a positive response, I dragged my rig down New Jersey's Route 46 to the Tractor Supply, where the manager, Mike, was waiting for me. I learned later that his staying to help me made him more than 2 hours late to get home to supper with his family on that Saturday night. I dismantled the wheel and hub on my trailer in that parking lot. Some people were oblivious and parked in ways that interfered with my efforts in the parking lot. But others were incredibly kind and offered advice and even gave me supplies. One man about my own age was minding his own business and sitting in his car chain-smoking. He couldn't be oblivious, but he did not acknowledge me. Mike was about to go home, and I was hitting a dead end, when the guy in the car spoke up. He introduced himself as a mechanic and gave me advice about what I was overlooking in my task. Before long, he got out of his car to help. Mike finally went home. The mechanic's name was Tim. He's been a mechanic all of his life, and he works on very high-end restorations and special projects at a nearby auto specialty business called Day 2 Automotive. His incredible skills quickly became apparent. My mechanical issues were quite basic, at least for him, but the lack of tools and resources that I was working with in that parking lot made the task difficult. We managed to get the old pieces apart, and he took me to a nearby auto parts store where I was able to get the larger bearings needed for my trailer. Tractor Supply only had smaller hubs and bearings. Tim's son works at the Tractor Supply, and Tim was waiting for his son to finish up later in the evening. Tim and I finally finished rebuilding my trailer's hub at 10 o'clock that night. working beneath the streetlights in that almost empty parking lot on a warm Saturday evening in late August. It took me another 4 hours and several caffeinated drinks to get home. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I pulled up my driveway nose first, shut down my van, and was done. I learned that carrying a spare wheel and tire for a trailer is not enough. From now on, I will carry a spare hub or two for any long trip, as well as the necessary tools. I set out to learn and increase my experience level this year, and I wanted to enjoy my new boat. I wish I could have done even more sailing, but I'll have more years in the future to do that. I enjoyed meeting everyone in Water Tribe, sailing with my son, and visiting my friends around the Chesapeake. And I am deeply grateful for the incredible kindness of Tim and Mike and the staff of that Tractor Supply store in New Jersey who took care of me when things went wrong. So, I have a couple of more interviews that I'm working on getting together over the next couple of months, and I will get those published as soon as I can. And moving forward, as I said, the changes in my life that are coming will give me more time to work on this podcast, and I'm looking forward to having more trips of my own to relate, but also be able to spend more time interviewing others about trails around the world. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sticking with the podcast, and I'm looking forward to the future. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Trails Around the World podcast. Please visit us online at trailsaroundtheworld.com. That's all one word. And please like the Facebook group under the same name. If you appreciated this podcast, please leave a review on your favorite podcast source, such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Happy trails to you.